Well, I'm excited to share what we're going to share about this morning. We've been on a lengthy journey for many years. Pardon me. And I wanted to record this so that people who aren't here today, people who might be coming in the future, people who are watching by live stream, that you'll have a reference point to tell people, go watch this, to see what God is doing and what is happening with our property and so forth. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a backdrop on our story. But before we do, I want to introduce two very special people here today, Bjarte and his mother, Ella Istebol. And they're from Norway, and part of what they're going to be celebrating the 200-year anniversary of the first immigrants coming to America from Norway. They're going to be celebrating that here over the course of the next year or so. And Ella's husband, Asbjørn, was very instrumental in working with Jackie's dad, Ted, to find buildings and so forth that the Norwegian immigrants built back in the 1800s when they first came here. And Ted would identify them, find them, verify that they were truly built by the Norwegian immigrants. And then Ella's husband, Asbjørn, would get a team of people from Norway, and we'd get a team of people from the U.S., mostly from the Minnesota area. And they would go disassemble these buildings, board by board, put them in containers, ship them back over to Sletta, Norway, which is about an hour drive outside of Bergen. And they built basically a living museum in honor of the immigrants, Norwegian immigrants. And the first building that they disassembled and then reassembled was, guess what? Yeah, the church. Because the church was always the center of community life. And it has been that for many, many decades. The last few decades, we are moving away from that. We have so many things to grab our attention for entertainment and our time. And the church is moving away from being actually the center of community life for people. That plays into actually our vision here. But what God has been doing is very miraculous. But I'm often reminded of the statement that Barry Maguire said. And when he said, God is never late. He's missed an awful lot of golden opportunities to be early, but he's never late. And I can identify with that because we've been waiting to some degree almost a quarter of a century for some of this. But I'd like to go back a little bit in time. And when Jackie and I first got married, we were really deeply embedded in a good way in trying to do whatever God asked us to do. Whatever God asked us to do, we were willing to do. We were willing to go, we were willing to be, we were willing to do whatever God asked us to do. And so for much of my life, especially our ministry life, we actually wanted to bless what God wanted to do rather than ask God to bless what we wanted to do. I wanted to bless what God was doing. I wanted to align myself with what God was doing. And sometimes the revelation of that and the understanding of that comes sometimes a little bit slowly. It comes over time. It comes in little snippets. And when we reflect back on our journey to this point in time, we can see where God was speaking things to us that we had no clue about at the time that he was speaking to us about them. we received a prophetic word. I can't remember how many years before we planted Hope. But this particular word became a kind of stake in the ground for me as I reflected back on it years later. And this word came from a friend of ours in California, David Canastraci, who's a Fuller theological graduate. He's deeply embedded in God's Word. But he's been around the prophetic movement a lot, and we trust his wisdom and insights. And David was praying over Jackie and I, and he painted this picture for me. He said, here's how you see yourselves. You see yourselves as a kind of a one-man band where, you have the guitar and you're singing, then you got the harmonica around your neck and you play that from time to time, and you got your foot on a bass drum, you're doing the bass drum, and then over here you got one of these clown horns that you'll squeeze every once in a while, and you're just doing all this, but he said, let me tell you the picture God has for you. And it was like God was tapping us on our shoulders because we're just doing our best with what little we had. And happy doing it, absolutely. Say that in the mic.
And yes. Happy doing it.
Yes, and happy doing it. And God was tapping us on our shoulders and asked us to turn around. And as we turned around, he opened up this massive curtain, and there was a 100-piece orchestra behind the curtain that God was putting into our charge to oversee. Well, at the time, there was no way that we could imagine how that would happen. We were music ministers and associate pastors in a church, and how many understand the challenges of trying to sometimes comprehend what God says to you? Amen. Right? Sometimes it's just a challenge to think, how can this happen?
I think we thought, you're going to have a big, huge church with a 100-piece orchestra.
Yeah. So of course, everything was put into the context of a church and what would happen inside that church. Some years later, our pastor asked Jackie and I to plant a church, which ultimately became Hope Community Church. And what I had imagined when God moved us in this direction, and when we were asked to do this, what I had imagined was that we would have a church. And that was it. Later, the location that we had for that church was being resisted by some of the members in the community, and ultimately the city council here in Corcoran years ago. The first time we came into the city, before we actually bought the property across the street, we had requested approval of the city to build a church in Corcoran. And the person who was mayor at that time was an old-time guy, long-time resident of Corcoran. And I would say that the way council meetings were run back in that day are a lot different than how they are run today. And we were on the agenda. The farm that Jackie and I are now living on was owned by a family called the Eckeses. Interestingly enough, they were the grandparents of Rich Scherber, who is the director of Teen Challenge. And so there was a lot of interesting connections here. So we were on the agenda. We had applied to build a church. We weren't going to close on the property until we knew we could at least build the church. And so we were on the agenda, and it comes to this item, and the mayor says, we have an application here for a Hope Community Church to build the church on the old Eckes farm. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have another church in Corcoran. All in favor say aye. And everybody said aye, and just like that, we got approved to build a church. It was all of 30 seconds in the city council. But then some of the neighbors resisted and didn't want the traffic, didn't want the church, and this kind of thing. And we ultimately hit a roadblock. There was a new election, new mayor, new council, and even though the new mayor supported us, there was a lot of resistance. I was told by some council that we should sue the city. And the Lord spoke to me very clearly. He said, are you going to trust me, number one? And how are you going to minister in the city that you sue? How will you ever live that down? How many years do you think will go by before the city actually will be open to you? So I knew that litigation was not an option. I'm not saying that for every situation. I'm just saying for us, that was not an option. And I remember the chairman of the planning commission saying to me after we had run into some roadblocks, Brian, just go home, mow your lawn, make your place look nice, and eventually you'll get what you want. Believe it or not, that was some of the best advice that anybody in the city ever gave me. And so we did that, and we waited, and we prayed, and even though the council had basically put 38 conditions on us that many were impossible to comply with in order to build a building, it just wasn't practical for us. They were limiting the size of the building to very, very small. They were even discussing when we could meet, and all this sort of stuff.
At one point I said, are we still in America?
Yeah, Jackie said that. Yeah, are we still in America?
It just seems
So, but the one thing the Lord told us to do is to go pray. And so we began to pray, and we prayed very earnestly as a church every Friday night for 6 months. And as we came to the end of that 6 months, I felt this kind of nudge by the Lord to call one of the council members to resurrect the discussions about building our church. And he agreed to meet me for lunch. We sat down, and the first thing out of his mouth was, Brian, I don't know what you want to talk to me about, but if it's to build a church on your property, we're not going to let you do it. So the first thought I had was, why in the world have we been praying all this time? You ever ask God that question? So then the next thing the Lord said to me was, ask him for his help and direction. Well, I was somewhat resistant to that because I felt like we had this adversarial relationship, right? Although it wasn't hostile. But I swallowed my pride and I asked him, said, well, you know, the city has given us permission to build a building. And we have this church of people. We need a facility that will work for us.
We were meeting in a school at that time
and we
for
were
6
meeting
years.
in a school. Yep, thank you. And so I just said, tell me what to do. What do you suggest we do? And I remembered the scripture in Romans 13 where the scriptures teach us that people have been put in government positions to be a blessing to us. Now, it didn't say believers are put in those positions. It just says people are put in those positions. And to pray for them. So he took out a map of the city. He pointed to this property here that we are currently on. And he said to me, Brian, if you can buy this property here, we'll let you build whatever you want. Really? Yes. If you can buy that property, we'll let you build whatever you want. Well, who owns it? I have no idea who owns it. Well, is it for sale? I don't know that either. But if you can buy this property, we'll let you build whatever you want. Well, I thought he was kind of blowing smoke at me. But I went from that meeting to City Hall, and on the City Hall counter at that time was a map of the city. And one of the ladies who I'd become familiar with, I asked her, Pat, who owns this property right here? And I pointed to this site. And she said, she gave me the strangest look. And she said, this must be God. Do you think that got my attention? I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, Brian, people have been trying to buy this property. Developers have been trying to buy that property for 20 years out here in Corcoran. And the owner has not been willing to sell. And he was just in here 20 minutes ago, and in the first time in his life, he wants to sell the property. So I hurried down to his house, which is the house that is on our property, the old homestead. 6 weeks later, we had a purchase agreement signed on this property. And I remember saying to Mike Brady, who was in our church at that time and a realtor, and he helped us pull this whole deal together. After we signed the purchase agreement, we walked out of the house, and I said, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for this? Ever ask yourself that question? But God gave us a plan. And the plan was to locate the church strategically on the property in such a way that we could do development around the church. And the challenge, of course, was development requires sewer and water to develop at a higher density. And so we were in this waiting pattern. The city felt it was going to come in 2005 or 6. In 2007, the crash happened, which delayed development in Corcoran by probably 10 to 12 years. But about 6 years ago, I got a call from the city, and the city said to me, can you come down to City Hall for a meeting? And that was not unusual. I'm the chairman of the Charter Commission here in Corcoran. I have served on the council. I've served on different committees in the city. So it's not unusual that I would be called into a meeting. What was different about this meeting, however, was that I was the only one in the meeting. And I started to think to myself, am I in trouble here? You know? And the city planners, the mayor, proceeded to tell me that they were looking for a site for their water treatment plant, the first water system in all of Northeast Corcoran. And they wanted to buy some of the acreage that Jackie and I owned across the street. Within a very short period of time, we had a deal put together, because I knew if the water treatment plant was going to be across the street, that would really benefit development on this site. Later on, when they were discussing locations for their water tower, it became obvious that the places they were thinking of putting it, all the neighbors were resisting it. So I called the council and the mayor and said, we got a spot at the church that will work, and I think it's a perfect spot. Come out and take a look. Well, 2 years later, we now are having this water tower built on our site, which means the city was now going to pay to bring sewer and water to our site, as opposed to us having to pay $5 million to bring sewer and water to our site. So things were now in motion. Things were working moving forward, but there were challenges all the time. And one Sunday, you were asking the Lord this really important question.
So every once in a while, I can get discouraged. Sorry, I'm human. And I don't know, that Sunday morning I was just discouraged. And I walked outside. I think I'd left something in my car, and I just I just stood out there and just thought, I have got to just talk to God. And, you get this idea of what is going to happen in what you're doing. And then it's an expectation. We're not supposed to create these expectations. We're just supposed to follow. Because when you create an expectation, you're setting yourself for disappointment. You are. Anyway, I said, God, what are we doing out here? Like, what? When we first came out here, I said to Brian, there was no people anywhere. I said, aren't you supposed to build a church where there's people? And he said, they're going to come, Jackie, and we'll be ready for
The
them.
Field of Dreams movie had just come out. You build it, they will come.
Yeah, that
type
was
of
the
thing,
line.
right?
That was the
So
line.
that was our motto for a
So
while.
I said to God, what are we doing out here, God? And I heard his voice so clearly in my heart. He said, I sent you out here to capture this land for me. Right when prices were manageable.
Yes.
Not now.
Not now.
Impossible.
Yes.
Yes. I sent you out here to capture this land for me. Oh, okay. That was all I needed to hear. And then since then I've just been thinking, we're just one link in the chain.
Yes.
God has a plan for this property that we're going to be long gone, and he's still going to be using this area for his glory. And he is lifted up and owns this corner.
So we ended up acquiring this property, and we built the church, and we were all excited. But then delays started to happen because of the economy, the crash in 2007, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a guy in our church who got a kind of a vision prophecy one day, in which, by the way, I'm a very big proponent of it when it's done the right way. The prophetic brings life, the prophetic gives encouragement, and it's something that you can hang on to in troubled times. And I think that a lot of times people are emulating Old Testament prophets when in reality they need to be thinking more in terms of the prophetic that Paul talked about in the book of Corinthians, where it's more on a personal level rather than a national level. Most of the national prophecies that I've heard throughout the last 40 years have been amok, personally. But there is personal prophecy that God speaks to people that is incredibly encouraging and helps you hang on in the darkest of seasons. And one of the prophetic words that was given was this guy said, Pastor Brian, I just saw people walking all across these fields to come to church. And I thought to myself, well, that doesn't make any sense. People walking across cornfields and bean fields to come to church. But I tucked it away and said thank you and kind of left it at that. Well, as time went on, we had a concept plan. When we built our building, I said to our architect, I want to submit a concept plan that the city can look at and say, we like this for the whole site. And so with that concept plan, we not only showed the church, but we showed a townhouse development, we showed some senior housing development, we showed some medical buildings on the commercial site, maybe a bank. I think the bank was part of one of them, and so forth. And we submitted that, and the council gave their thumbs up on that at the same time they approved us building the church. So now, as time went on, the plan began to gain clarity, because one of the things we did was we had this perspective that we needed to partner with our city, not demand or tell the city what we were going to do, but we wanted to partner with our city. And so I began to schedule meetings with the city council, et cetera, and they began to give us input. So last February, when we submitted our preliminary plat application, and one of the things that strategically we needed to do. And someone might say, why have you had to raise money, and why has this cost so much? And it's because in order for us to control what happened on the whole site, we actually had to become the developer on it. So by us applying for the preliminary plat application, we could control and design what went where and what happened on our site, rather than just sell our land as raw land to a developer and let them do whatever they wanted to it. I didn't want that to happen. That was never part of the vision. And so it's cost us a substantial amount of money. We crossed the finish line this past week on the first plat. We're so thankful for that. And we submitted a concept plan with the city, and on the 12th of September, the city approved the final plat of this property. So I'd like to show you what has basically been approved. Now, this is a little challenging to look at, but I got a good pointer. See, that we can see this one now. So here is County Road 116. Down here is County Road 30. And here is a new street that we're building. This is the original entrance, which is going to continue all the way across to the westerly edge of our property. The city council overruled the medical emergency people who were requesting that this street be called 100th Avenue. And I wanted it to be called Hope Way. And the council unanimously approved calling this Hope Way. So what we closed on last Wednesday was this section here and this little fourth section here. This is going to be closed next spring. And this is a townhome area of 45 townhomes. By the way, this street in here is called Haven Avenue. Isn't that a nice name? Haven Avenue. And then these are 4 senior villas, as well as all of these right here, and there's going to be some more right there. So the church is right here. This is the parking lot. Here's the church building. Here's the cemetery, and so forth. Okay?
You didn't name that street. The builder did.
Yeah, I didn't even name this Haven Avenue. The new builder called it Haven Avenue, and his whole development is called Hope Meadows. Yeah. So this whole development here is called Hope Meadows, okay? So in addition, we have, let me go through this whole site here, and then I'll show you some other pictures. So we have some senior condos here. We have a multifamily building here of 184 units. We have some additional senior housing that will be next to the church, right in this area. This corner right down here, we are hoping to have an area for vulnerable adults that will be the first in America that would be owner-occupied. The people who will occupy it, their family can own this product in a trust. One of the biggest concerns for people who have vulnerable adults as children is what happens to my child when I die. And this, we're working with a lawyer in Georgia and a developer in Texas to be the first one in the whole United States to have a facility right in that area that will be for vulnerable adults.
Just think how we can bless their lives as a church.
Yes, I know it. So as we move further to the south, this is north, this is south down here, we have 2 medical buildings that will be built here. We also have 2 commercial developments that can be built there. We've gotten a lot of interest from grocery stores like Aldi's or Jerry's Foods. 2 very successful medical entities are working with us right now, very interested in the site. A high-end restaurant, by high-end I mean something like Maynard's, that kind of restaurant, wants to come on the site. There's also one more multifamily building in this area that would be built. And this is the water tower right there. Sorry for my shaking hand. I'm 73 now, so. But the cemetery is also going to expand down into this area as well.
I just talked to a young man in our church who has he wants to give you a beautiful idea he has for a cafe. Oh, he just told me more ideas, so.
Yes, and I think it would go great right about in here.
Okay.
But we'll talk.
We'll
So I'd like to go through real quickly some pictures of some renderings that we have. So let's go to the next picture, please. So this is what the row home, townhome area would look like. There'll be anywhere from 4 to 6 to 7 to 8, depending on what part of the site plan they're on. The senior villas, let's go to the next picture. This will be one of the senior villas. These all have the option of having 2 or 3 stall garages. This one would be one of the smaller of the senior villas. The next one, that's a little bigger. You can see a 3-stall garage here. And then the next one is, no, go back. I think you're missing one. Or maybe you didn't get it. That's okay. We'll go on, okay? We'll go on. So let's go on to the next picture you had. So this will be like one of the senior rental units. So you can see it's obviously got a lot of amenities to it. It'll be a 4-story building, 200 and ultimately 200 and maybe 40 units in it. Then we also have, the next slide please, this is also senior, but this will be like condos. So this would be owned by people. So we have the option of renting as well as owning here. And then the next picture shows, now we missed it again. So this is, okay, this jumps down to, there we go. So this is the multifamily rental where you have a rooftop, terrace, and so forth. Again, not 4-story. This particular rendering shows solar. I don't know if that'll be with this or not. We're just trying to show some options, but this will be a 4-story multifamily. And then let's go to that next one, which is a medical. This is somewhat what the medical building will look like. And then we also have some commercial development, which will be an option like this, as well as coffee shops, restaurants, and so forth. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate our current city council and the city staff. They worked very, very hard getting us to where we are at today. There were a lot of challenges. It costs a lot of money to develop, particularly in Corcoran where there's no infrastructure. We have to front the money for the infrastructure and then recoup it on the back end. And so keep praying for that because we've had to put out a lot of money or are committed to paying a lot of money in the course of the next month or so. But the hardest domino to get to fall is the first one. And that's fallen. The first one is fallen. And so it's a time to celebrate. Jackie and I have looked back through some of the prophetic words we've received in the last 25, 30 years. And we came across a prayer that a friend of ours in California, and this man was unfortunately killed in a motorcycle accident many years ago. But when we had just come out here, we had no clue about what we were going to do. He had just heard we were going to plant a church. And he prayed for us, and this is what he prayed. Lord, give them favor with the building departments and city officials and everyone with whom they must do business in order to complete this work. Lord, we ask that you grant the provision for every phase of this project. Little did he know, he was actually praying a prophetic prayer. Because,
little did we know.
And little did we know, yeah. Because there are probably 9 or 10 phases to this project. This could go for 4, 5, 6 years before it's completed. And yet, God is at work, and I'm so thankful today for your prayers, your support, and this is just a beginning. And when these buildings are occupied, people literally will be able to walk across these fields and come to church.
And this is going to generate a lot of money,
Yes.
revenue for the church.
It'll generate a lot of
Of
revenue.
course, we'll be able to pay off
Yep,
our church.
we'll pay off our
and just
mortgage.
talk about the trust and how we'll be able to help ministries all over.
Yes. So obviously there's more money that should be coming into the church than what we need to pay off our mortgage. Considerably more money than that. And one of our goals is to form a legacy giving endowment where we can perpetually have this endowment grow, but also long after we've gone, we'll have something in place to keep supporting not only Hope Community Church, but other ministries like the Uganda mission that we support, our missionaries in Hungary, our missionaries in Mexico, and so forth, or other missions that we want to start. And I think it's important that we understand the principle about not eating your seed completely. Take some of it, eat it, invest the rest, plant the rest, so that long after all of us might be gone, something solid will remain on this corner for Jesus. He didn't want us to capture this corner for just one generation. He wanted it captured until he comes back.
It feels so good to have this set up for the next generation.
Yes, it
you
does.
know?
It does.
Because things are going to get harder for churches.
It is.
Yes.
More and more challenges. But God dropped into our hearts this plan. And it's starting to come to pass. Prophecy has a long shelf life. Prophecy has a long shelf life. Some of the prophetic words given to us were at the very beginning of this church, and we've held on to them for 25 years. And we are seeing the fulfillment of that. I know, Diane, you've been with us since the beginning. Joanne, you've been with us since the very beginning, first Sunday here at Hope. A few others, Randy, you've been around. You've been in China for part of that time, but you've been part of us since the beginning. And we're so grateful for the people who are here, who've walked with us, and we are now seeing the fulfillment of some of these things. And so growth can happen in a lot of different ways. It's a challenge to have a church kind of in the middle of a cornfield and not the middle of a community. But God has been faithful to get us to this point. And I can just see incredible things happening in the next 5 years for this church.
I just have to say that when God, sent us out here to capture this land, that he picked you specifically, Bri, because it's been a vision that you got from God, and you kept it all these years. There were so many discouraging times.
Yeah.
But you never let it die, and you have been so faithful and patient. And I'm very proud of you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. There are people like my mom and dad, Ted and Ruby, Gary, Harding, many others who today are celebrating this day. Oftentimes they think, out of sight, out of mind, but they're part of that great cloud of witnesses. And I believe they're cheering us on today. And they were all part of getting us to this point, and many others who aren't here. But they're excited. They're excited about what is being established here. And if we can carry that excitement as well, we'll just see God begin to open up many, many more doors.